I was in Paris about 6 weeks ago, and I was told by Jean-François Bayat, the other chair in the pôle sociologique, that I had to speak in English. And I let you decide why he would say that. But my colleague of many, many years, Mohamed Dozy, was here, and I just asked him, why aren't you introducing me? And he said, it's to show the autonomy of the other chair. So I have the good reason there. My title is a broad one, as you can see, Islam and Governance After the Arab Springs. Notice the plural. It is a plural because I read French, and I read Jean-François Bayat, and I think that he had a very good idea. Especially in the United States, there's a tendency for students and the general public to think of the Middle East and North Africa as one big pot with no differentiation in it, from Morocco at one end to, it can go to Pakistan or Afghanistan, depending on how you feel. And as Moroccans, as many of you are, I think you're aware that there's quite a bit of difference. Let me begin with one of my favorite quotes from Vladimir Ivanovich Lenin, not an anthropologist, who said, we have decades when nothing happens, and then we have weeks where decades happen. And that's a good way to think about the Arab Springs. With one exception, I would argue that the main changes were happening all along. They became visible in 2011, and they became visible in different ways. And even the term Arab Spring, or Arab Springs, as Jean-François and I prefer, is an abstraction. For Europeans, in any case, it conjures up the Prague Spring of 1968. Now, since many of you were not born in 1968, you know it from history books. And let me remind you what happened with the Prague Spring. It was then crushed by the Soviet Union. And you didn't hear anything more about what this Prague Spring was for many, many years. And we have a, when you combine the term Islam and governance, you have a very interesting sort of thing where I used to have lots of resistance to talking about Islam and politics because American political scientists know, or thought they knew, that religion has nothing to do with politics. And if you believe that, then you have not learned very much. Anyone has not learned very much for many years. In fact, for not here, but elsewhere, the very notion of Islam is what the English philosopher Richard Rorty calls a conversation stopper. When you want to talk about politics and you say, oh, let's talk about Muslim politics, suddenly everybody stops thinking and they say, well, no, Islam is something that stops development or does other things. Bad things happen. Well, that I assure you is not my view. But my view is not to look at the spectacular things such as happened in Egypt with, I think it was the 11th of January 2011 when President Mubarak left office. The Economist, the English magazine, not L'Economiste, the local one, back in 2010, had a special issue on Egypt, which it called Egypt, Holding Its Breath, by which they meant that the big things happening were the things you all know. 60% of the people of the Middle East and North Africa at that time were under 30 years of age. Now, birth rates have gone down, but a nice thing about demographers or demography is that it takes 20 or 30 years before it makes a difference, unless you kill off a generation, as Bashar al-Assad and others are unfortunately being successful at. And most of the young of this age group, under 30, are under or unemployed. You used to have safety valves, I'll talk about, like emigration, economic emigration. But what you have now, I'm going to adjust these so there's less echo, I hope. What you have now is emigration because of desperate refugees. Some Syrians are not desperate. They have extended family connections. But if you live in a refugee camp, or if you become the equivalent of a haraga, then your life is not very good. Now, I would argue, because again, I'm looking at some things that become visible, but looking at what happens in between, that when we talk about the Muslim world, and we could talk about many other places as well, that you're dealing with ideals and practices that are always contested, contingent, and emerging. In other words, you will have some people say, I used to hear a lot in parts of the Middle East, saying, Al-Islam wahid. Islam is one thing and it never changes. As I explained to a tribal diwaniyah in Kuwait once, because you can be tribal and you can be not with a university degree and very sharp. They said, okay, professor, you've traveled to many places. Who has the real Islam? And I said, well, you know, some taxi drivers in Fez have told me they have the real Islam. And in the Sultanate of Oman, they would say to me, we in Sohar have the real Islam, not those people in Shinas or Muscat. Okay, that's fine. And in Jakarta, some people knew the real Islam as well. And I would say, I know what the real Islam is and where you can find it, as I said in Arabic. I said, God knows. And the problem is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala last spoke to humankind through the Prophet Muhammad, and he's not saying who's closest to his idea of what Islam is anymore. And they thought this was a reasonable answer. And that's the closest we can get. And for me, the interesting thing about that answer was that even for people not in a university, they were thinking about their religion, but at the same time thinking critically about their religion and being aware that not everyone agreed on what Islam is. Alhamdulillah, what a wonderful idea. Now, why is Richard Rorty still there? Oh, because I have not mastered the technology, that's why. Muslims, like everyone else, recycle, revive, reinvent, rethink, reimagine, reinterpret. Al-Qaeda used to produce videos where you could see Osama bin Laden, where except for his Rolex watch and his Kalashnikov, would conjure up the idea that he was following in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad, of going away from the center, Mecca, to somewhere else, so that you could reconcentrate the Muslim community and come back. That's kind of an interesting idea, but it would be very, very different. One key thing, I think, to understanding Muslim politics, which I'll give a working thing of at the moment, is to see how different it is from, for example, some American ideas of politics in the Middle East. I write things down. I guess that's what makes me a scholar. In November 2007, in an interview in Newsweek, not exactly a rare publication, somebody called Condoleezza Rice, our Secretary of State, said that she just had presented to her a brand new model of politics in the Middle East, in which you could not just talk to a head of state, you had to talk to tribal leaders, regional leaders, students, and everything else. MashaAllah. What a brand new idea to get through to her. And of course she was right, but I'm quoting exactly what she said. This is a brand new idea to her. Well, fortunately, with Jean-Francois Bayart and Mohammed Tozi, you will not be exposed to that kind of political science. Watch him on that. And when I use the term Muslim politics, I'm not talking about one thing, but I'm talking about the arguments people have about what is the proper role of religion in political life. You can have some people say that religion should have nothing to do with politics. You have others saying it has something to do, but it's a shifting boundary. You can have everything in between. In Turkey, a Turkish friend of mine who was 10 years ago complaining about how the American embassy kept inviting people who were the head of labor unions and the head of official groups, but not unofficial people to things, suggested that rather than having cocktail parties where you might have beer and other things that some people drink and some don't, to have ayran parties. Ayran is a yogurt drink, which more Turks drink than whatever it is below. I don't know what is the Institut des, used to be called Viniculture in Salé, now has, but in the 1990s at one point, somebody knocked off Vini from Culture, so it became the Institut des Cultures, which I thought was an interesting way of dealing with the issue. So Muslim politics is politics basically by Muslims, and being Muslim is something that people have to argue about, just as you do about other big terms. Abdullah Larawi, years ago, wrote a book called Mafhum Demokratiya, The Understanding of Democracy, which had very little to do with Morocco, but it had a lot to do with how people understood a broad term. Or Mafhum Hurriya was another of his books as well, which got people to start thinking about things. Now, I'm going backward again. This is interesting. Okay. I think perfect. Okay. Yeah, and we're back. Sometimes things will change very quickly. At a certain time earlier, the United States spent millions of dollars to produce media commercials about how friendly the United States was to Muslims. Private Lindy England, who had a little cell phone that could take pictures, took some pictures at Abu Ghraib of her work. And once those pictures got distributed, the multi-million-dollar campaign of the Americans just collapsed because it was hard for our official representatives to say, we represent نمثل الديمقراطية and everything else. This suggests that we were perhaps representing something else. But if you can read what I put underneath this photograph, the long-term trends, even despite the fact so many people have to move because they're refugees, are what's happened in the last 50 or 60 years. Greater ease of migration and travel. What Moroccan family is without a relative in Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, or some other place? The smallest villages will have people coming back, and this is replicated everywhere. You used to be able, last time I was in Syria, it was March 2011, to smaller villages, and you would always have people who were working somewhere else to allow the village to survive. The second thing is a shift from elite to mass education. At one time, for instance, I remember early studies of secondary school education in Morocco. People thought that if you got a secondary school diploma, the baccalaureate, that piece of paper would give you a job. And that was true once upon a time. It stopped being true. Now you get a piece of paper. And the job thing is something else. And the third thing, of course, is the rapid transformation in communications technology. الاتصالات الحديثة. I co-edited a book with the title New Media, which came out in 2003. That's old media now. Facebook is old media now. Things change very quickly, and the way people can communicate and organize for all sorts of purposes has changed. Manuel Castells, a Spanish sociologist whom I admire, uses the term real virtuality. What you put up in images, like what Private Lindy England did, is more powerful on the mind. That is something that really stops conversation or steers it in another way. And when you talk about Daesh as well, and I certainly am not fond of them, you have exactly the same sort of thing too. Very skillful propaganda, which as much as we find it perhaps disgusting, we have to ask ourselves, well, who watches this? Who gets inspired by this? Because it will tell us things about ourselves that perhaps we have to know even if we don't want to know them. So one of the things that you get in the current debates is what I would call a mainstreaming of Islam. One of these people is an anthropologist. He doesn't mainstream anything. The other person is Fethullah Gulen, who was a state-trained village preacher as he began his life, but somebody who made the transition between speaking face-to-face with people and being able to communicate by television. I had my first meeting with him. He was still living in Istanbul. He was very concerned about his personal safety. But I said, you know, I asked him, what's the main difference between his audiences now and before? He said, I see fewer people. But he learned how to master the new media so that he could speak to people as if, because many people would say this, he was sitting across from them and talking in metaphors that everyone could understand. The highly educated would understand him in one way, and those who weren't so educated would understand him in a different way. Turkey may seem far away, but it also is a place where you have very powerful demonstrations about the government and changes. This is what politics is all about in most places. But what interests me is how and who is able to maintain a dialogue on what there is. In 1995, a colleague of mine, Richard Norton, got a lot of people together to talk about civil society in the Middle East. And one of the things he said, it's a region, as we all know, that has authoritarian regimes. That's the sort of abstraction, ta'abir al-majazi, that we all learn to deal with. But once you get beyond the abstraction, there's all sorts of different meanings as well. I can provide, if anybody wanted, quotes even from Bashar al-Assad talking about, at least until 2011, his road to democracy. Even the worst tyrants will use the term of democracy. Or take a look at North Korea, which I don't think anybody wants to go to live. It's the People's Democratic Republic. The word democracy has captured the imagination. But when you are really authoritarian, you're excluding other people, and you make it harder to make transitions of what people want now that more people are educated and more people have the experience of living in different places. Sometimes transitions work. For all of the roughness of Tunisia, which continues until today with the Bardo Museum incident, one of the secrets is what happens behind the scenes, and I'll say more, where the police and what Tunisians have of an army and others agreed to work with the new regime, or what followed after Ben Ali. One of the I'm going to pass that. One of the best books, I think, on the transition in Tunisia is by Béatrice Hibou, again, a French colleague. And as I tell people, it's the English translation of her book in 2011, the first 40 pages one should look at, because her book on Ben Ali's kleptocracy was first published in 2007, as I recall, possibly 2008. But in 2011, because I was the person responsible for seeing the book come out in English, she added 40 pages in which she explained how the transition was made and how many things did not change. Business leaders, police, security services, everybody agreed that Ben Ali was not able to continue. But the transition is going reasonably well as these things go. It's never a very easy sort of thing. Everybody knows Tahrir Square. This is something from a man who weaves kind of wall hangings and quilts for a living, mostly for tourists. But since there were no tourists after January 2011, he produced this beautiful tapestry, Hani Abdul Qadir, of his view, this is simply a workman, a craftsman, of Tahrir Square in 2012 as he saw the revolution. Because revolutions have to deal with people from the bottom up as well as top down. You have an interesting succession of leadership in Egypt from Hosni Mubarak, here seen behind bars, and then we go to Mohammed Morsi, seen behind bars. But to give you, I'm being very ironic, a ray of hope, President Sisi is not behind bars, you'll notice, yet. And there he is dressed in civilian clothes. But what one has had in the transitions is a dramatic display of power and authority at the top. But revolutions work when you get a convergence of people from the bottom as well. They don't always work. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi is no longer with us. How many of you have ever read his Al-Kitab al-Akhdar, the Green Book? You own it?
Yes, no, yeah, in Libya for about 4 years, and I know what you're talking about.
Yes, it's a book of complete nonsense, in my view, but I would not have said that if I were living in Libya for 4 years. I would have had a shorter existence. The only comparison I could make would be with Sagan Murat Nizayov, who many of you may not have heard of. He was the president for life of Turkmenistan, who signed only one book, the Rohnama, which was his rather preposterous things. And this was the only book used in secondary schools until 2006, when presumably things got a little better. But Gaddafi was very good at providing Potemkin villages, if you wish. Grigory Potemkin was a minister under Catherine the Great, and in 1787, to show the progress of Russian peasants, he constructed not whole villages along the Volga, but facades like theater props of villages, and to have peasants show how happy they were to come out and wave at visiting diplomats. Colonel Gaddafi was rather good at that, and as you know, his son, Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi, managed to purchase a PhD from the London School of Economics. It was a big scandal. Don't try it, even if your daddy or mother have a lot of money. It's harder to do now. There is a big report on this, the Lord Wolfe report, which I use for a book I'm writing on secrets and lies, because it shows how universities respond when people corrupt the entire system, which he did. But Saif al-Islam is in Libya awaiting trial. Bashar al-Assad was rather good at media. This is from 2011, November. And from his personal website, only a brave man protect his own people. I'm not giving you a lesson in English, but protects is the way I think most people would say it. And yes, he really protects his own people in his own way. Keep in mind too, I forgot to mention that Colonel Gaddafi made a brilliant analysis of the demonstrations in the Arab world in 2011. He said that demonstrators were drinking Nescafe with milk laced with those drugs that Al-Qaeda was distributing to people. This is a brilliant insight about what caused the Arab Springs. Now, what's against that, for better and worse, is the idea of mainstreaming Islam. This is a book by a Pakistani where she uses the term secular Islam entering the mainstream, because, as I said, you have lots of debates. But here's the 4 points that will frame what I remain to say. Mainstreaming Islam, or trying to get a voice in public, means taking charge. I'll give you a local example. Organizing and communicating, working effectively behind the scenes, both domestically and internationally, and inspiring trust and cooperation, where even if you like to do things in secret, you have to pretend to do them more in public. Taking charge. Ahmed Tawfiq is, I think, a good example of entering the public sphere. There's other examples that I would give. I could give them of people who are not in power and authority, but among the other things that struck me is just, what was it, 2 weeks ago? There was something Moroccans have been doing all along, but now it's more official, developing a school for imams, not only in Morocco, because that's been done with Dar Hadith al-Hassaniya for years and years and years, but of making something more official where Morocco can export its soft power to parts of West Africa, Tunisia, and elsewhere to suggest ways in which one can engage people with more positive views of what politics should be like. Keep in mind, for a lot of people like Fethullah Gulen, Islam is not political, but Islam gives you the moral values by which we should all live and inspires people to be more honest in public. So the first thing is trying to do things in public and to engage people, because when you engage people in public, even if you're a minister, you get all sorts of feedback. What I like about Morocco is some people will be quiet in public, but behind the scenes, it's something else. There's some people from Bejaad, where I worked for many years here. I used to go with a member of parliament, Habib Malki, and at the beginning, he would speak in the very elevated Arabic that he would know, although he would prefer French. And everyone would just listen in Beni Bitao or in the other areas. But by the 1990s, people would talk back to him. And like some members of parliament, you have so many things to do in Rabat, you would not always go home. And I would hear people say, "Ya Habib, if we vote for you again, will we see you again? Or are you just going to go off and be somewhere?" And I'm not saying this to pick him out, but people could talk back in public, which is the big change which creates a different sort of situation. The second thing is organizing, communicating. If Fethullah Gulen was just talking to himself, he would still be a village preacher. But he has thousands of people who help create schools in the United States, Mongolia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Europe, and everywhere else that are affordable and accessible, and in which in the official schools there's no religion, because that's the way that things work. You have lots of people who organize and communicate. You have a number of media preachers now, some in Qatar, like Yusuf Sha'rawi and others, where if you can read big books, you've got big books. You can read them. And if you can't read big books, maybe you can listen to an audio tape and download it from the internet. You can do many, many things in between, à la portée de tout, at your own level, if you wish, of things. The next thing making this point is working effectively behind the scenes. Who knew Khalid Said in Egypt until he died? Okay. Yes, exactly. Yeah, but then he became a symbol for many other things, and it's people who could manage the public face of the symbol who were working behind the scenes very quickly to grab the conversation and make a point about things. Qaboos bin Said of Oman is the person I would use to inspire trust and cooperation. Now, how do you do that? Because he does not talk very often in public, but what he does is works behind the scenes. Now, again, just a question of you. How many know anything about the Ibadiyya? The Ibadiyya, al-Madhhab al-Ibadi. Yeah, what Tunisia شوية. Yeah, well, شوية في جنوب الجزائر and all that. But for Oman, the modern Ibadism is something that's, let's say, it's very quiet and very moderate as we would say. And Oman, as you'll notice, with the current situation, is not joining the armies of Egypt, the Emirates, and the Saudis in anything. Oman is the place where, with both the ruler and others, it's the intermediary, il-wasta, between Iran and other places, and it works rather well. It's how the Americans began to talk with the Iranians. It's a projection of what I would call soft power. Example, oops. Okay, no, I'm not going to give the example here, but an example, for instance, would be the Omani Minister of Religious Affairs, Abdullah Muhammad Salami, who is the only Minister of Religious Affairs I've ever met who, he was responsible in 1997 for changing the name of the ministry from Wizarat al-Awqaf wa Sha'un al-Islamiyya to Sha'un al-Diniyya. And I said, why did you do that? And he said, well, his first answer was, I have about 200 Hanud in Oman who are citizens. And I said, mashallah, this is just really wonderful. And what other reason? And he said, Mohammed Tozi would like this, he said, I read Max Weber, the sociologist, and now I understand the difference between Islam with Deen is more abstract. And it was an amazing conversation, but it's one that he would follow up and would do to manage religious affairs by finding ways you could talk back. Now, secrecy, a lot of people would use. This is from Taroudant in July 1999, the day that Hassan II died. Al Jazeera television announced it, I believe, in the morning, as the BBC did. It was announced in Morocco on the Radio Télévision Marocaine in the evening. And I once asked somebody why the long delay, and I was told, Monsieur Eickelman, you have to understand, we are the official voice of Morocco. We had to make sure the king was dead. In Taroudant, the area was shut down. You could not travel between towns because the Minister of the Interior believed in secrecy. And televisions were brought out in public places so you could see the official announcement. But everybody knew. And so what they learned was that their government, or the Ministry of the Interior, was the last place to get the fresh news. They would make sure that there was a change of things. Well, this teaches people a certain suspicion about governments that is part of the old school, which I think has changed, or should. There's a 1935 book by Sinclair Lewis, a novelist, American, called It Can't Happen Here. It's about the United States becoming a dictatorship. And in the 30s, with fascism and communism in the air, it's a very serious sort of thing. And again, something that was showing some of the changes coming along was the 17th of May, 2003. I was in Morocco at the time, and this brought a number of Moroccans to focus their attention on changes in their own society. And it was the beginning of a series of responses to things. Well, to play on the words of Sinclair Lewis, it did happen here. Morocco is not immune to what is going on elsewhere. And it could happen again. Just before I came to Morocco this time, I read in Le Mag the account of a sweep in which a number of extremist cells were rounded up in different parts of the country. And there were two things today in the newspapers. One was yet more arrests, and the second thing was Ahmed Tawfiq bringing together a number of ulama to talk about mafhum al-salafiyya, which again is a way of bringing things in public. So let me conclude. Well, here we have it again. Okay. Yes, thank you, Etienne. There's one more slide, maybe. MashaAllah. Okay, no, he's out of place. That's the Minister of Religious Affairs of Oman. Goodbye. Okay. So here's the things I'd say. In taking charge now, you have to be ready to adapt and respond quickly. You lose trust if you don't engage in serious dialogue with people. The second thing is that in organizing and communicating, it's not just top-down, unless you believe in the Green Book, for example. It's also bottom-up. Lots of people have ideas and know how to communicate them, and do. So governance now means, or talking about politics, means being open to very rapid and sudden transformations in which you try to have lots of people do things. The third is effective working behind the scenes. Whether you're talking about Hillary Clinton's aspirations to become a political leader in the United States or someone else, anybody in governments, outside of governments, trying to promote their views have to have lots of people with different skills and specialties working with them. People who understand al-itasalat al-haditha, who are capable of taking words and images and making them count. And finally, inspiring trust and confidence. The hardest sort of thing to do. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. Both governments and people have to be ready to change, and likewise religious leaders. So that's it. You're in a very good place. I'm learning my French, le pôle sociologique. How would you say that in Arabic? El-Qutb, el-Ulum al-Ijtimaiya, maybe? No, it's too heavy. But you're in a new school, a school that takes thinking about societies very seriously, and I wish you the very best in your studies or teaching. Thank you.